Hi, I'm Daniel Dubois, your host for the Think Like a Wizard podcast. Welcome to episode 3 Senses, Emotions, Empathy, and Spirituality in the Spiritual Plane. As before, I'll share a bit about myself. Today I'm going to share a bit of an amusing story, amusing to me, anyways. I woke up in the morning to the presence of 3 spirits, or I should say, one of them showed up in my dream and asked me to wake up. It was about time to wake up anyway, so I did. I'll clarify that at this point in my life, when a spirit shows up to me when I'm sleeping, I'm very aware if it's part of my dream or not. Typically, they're not interacting with anything in the dream, and it feels more like when someone is trying to wake you up, so you realize that and you wake up. They were aware that I'm working on a course to teach others channeling and otherwise how to communicate with the spirit realm. They approached me because they wanted me to teach the people they are working with. I explained that I'm not quite done working it out, but I am alpha testing it right now with the student to see what I may need to include or exclude based on the initial outline that I created. When we were done chatting about that, one of the spirits, a bear, or at least one presenting itself as a bear, said to me, not exactly its words, as I don't remember the exact words, I can't help but notice you're not taking your laundry out of the dryer and folding it. You're right, I responded. It realized that I did not have the do housework mindset going on at the time, so it said, tell you what, since you're agreeing to help with our people, why don't you let me help you? Because of how spiritual interactions work, I knew it wanted to fold my laundry for me. It just needed permission to guide my body. So I let it. It folded the clothes and put it in the clothes basket and was done. Then it let go of my body. Shortly after that, the 3 spirits said their goodbyes and left. This story amuses me for 2 reasons. The first reason is because we think of channeling, we, myself included, tend to think of getting profound life-changing messages from the spirit realm, or we think of people channeling powerful spirits to wreak havoc on people or perform some kind of miraculous intervention to save the day. But in this case, it was just to fold my laundry, and the spirit offered. I didn't ask, it just did it of its own volition. Secondly, it amuses me because I have a statement I make every time someone tells me how they received a message from dead relatives or from a spirit of some kind. Someone will say, I was missing my grandfather, so he gave me a sign he was around by turning on my radio and making it play a song that makes me think of him. If the atmosphere is suitable for humor, I'll respond with, in this case, why do you make your grandpa work so hard? Well, my grandpa's spirit wants to let me know he's around. He just approaches me and says hi. As a channeler, spirits don't have to bend over backwards to let me know they're there. So I like to tease people about it when they get these huge gestures. In a way, I'm sad for people that spirits have to make such huge efforts to let them know they're around. For me, they just typically send a vibe and I know they're around thinking about me. No big mystery, no what ifs, no lingering doubts. I'm going to start by giving the terminology I use when discussing these topics. I generally break reality into 3 planes: the material plane, the plane we react to and live our material lives in, the psychological plane, or our headspace, our mental landscape. It's not an actual plane, it's a conceptual place where we work out our thoughts and emotions. And finally, the spiritual plane, that place beyond our material world where what we call the supernatural occurs. Keep in mind that no matter the plane, it is all part of the natural world. I just use the term supernatural because for the most part, everyone understands that I'm referring to a greater spiritual reality when I use it. I imagine that to a good deal of you listening, that this is an episode you have been looking for. That part where we discuss senses, emotions, empathy, and spirituality as supernatural phenomena. But before we jump into that, I want to say that you should use skepticism when engaging in spiritual topics. Not because I want you to mistrust me, or that these are topics that have more than their fair share of people who misunderstand or who mislead attached to them. I mean, you should, or at least could be skeptical for those reasons. But I want you to understand that these are difficult topics to navigate. It's one thing for me to describe them like I'm going to in this episode. It's another to go out into the world and work with what I shared. I want you to always ask yourself questions about what you are experiencing or have experienced. You're going to make mistakes and you're going to misunderstand situations. Do yourself a favor and learn to question yourself in a way that helps you get to the heart of the matter of what you're dealing with. Not taking events at surface value can go a long way in helping you with your awakening or with your journey of self discovery. I want to give you an example of what I mean by this. I occasionally have precognitive dreams. There was a point in my life when I was desperate for an answer about a potential relationship with a woman I knew. I had a dream where she and I were hanging out, and I was performing a mock weapon kata, or form if you prefer, with a half-filled bag of brown sugar. In my desire to seek any sign on what to do, I assumed this dream was a message from above, quote unquote. It so happened I also had booked an appointment to get a psychic reading, so I mentioned that dream at the reading. The reader told me that dreaming about sugar meant that I would be coming into money. That felt so wrong to me. The whole sugar bag mock weapon kata is something I do to amuse myself and to humorously display my physical prowess. I relayed that to the reader, and she insisted that it meant money would be coming. Given that I'm talking to you about being skeptical, it probably won't surprise you to know that the reader was wrong about the sugar, and I was wrong about the dream being a message from up above. After that reading, I found a book on dream interpretation from a psychologist who laid out ways to interpret dreams. And when I used her techniques, my understanding of the dream and that element was that I was trying to impress that woman with my mock weapon kata, and the dream was me contemplating how to win over this woman. An entirely normal dream. Your brain is always processing problems you have in hopes of finding solutions. And think about it. Displaying our physical abilities to a potential mate is one of our instinctual methods to try and gain their favor. After that, I became enamored with normal dreams, and that led me on a journey to learning to distinguish between special dreams and normal ones. Going down a mundane route to learn about how to interpret dreams led me to be better at understanding the special ones. I shared this because I don't want anyone to assume that everything unusual or anything that aligns with their fondest desires is necessarily something supernatural. Your material nature as a human being has a lot of traits and mechanisms that help you navigate your life. You don't always need supernatural intervention to succeed at things or achieve your dreams. Barring irregularities, you are, as a material being, equipped to deal with the bulk of life's challenges. And of course, as I just shared about dreams, understanding your material capacities helps you better at recognizing your spiritual capacities. Okay, now we're doing it. We're going to jump into the supernatural aspects of things, or as I will now be saying going forward, in the wizard sense. I'm doing that in part to keep with the theme of the podcast and because, frankly, it amuses me. I'm going to start with spirituality. As I previously stated, spirituality is about seeing the big picture and how the individual elements in it work together. In the wizard sense, spirituality is being aware of and in some way or another able to interact with the spirit realm with greater ease than others. As there is a distinction between spirituality as a personality trait and a skill set, there's also a difference with those versions and being spiritual in the wizard sense. Someone with an easier connection to the spirit realm doesn't necessarily take the time to see the big picture. They could still just be concerned with their own experience and may have no idea what their expanded awareness means to them or to the world around them. As an example, in my time growing up with a trickster teacher, I never understood that it worked with me because of my connection with the spirit realm, nor did I give any thought to the fact that it might be affecting others around me. It was only when I was coming into adulthood that people shared stories with me about how they were being affected that I understood that while I may have been the main focus of my trickster teacher's attention, others were still being affected by it and what I went through. Now let's get to the juicier stuff. What exactly is the spiritual realm? It's the greater reality. I don't mean just beyond our human sensory bubble. Other forms of life have different sensory perspectives on the world than we do as humans, but they aren't necessarily aware of the greater reality because of it. Regardless of species, our senses tend to be geared towards meeting our species' needs. Yes, we are evolutionarily speaking always changing, but for the most part, we are generally the same from generation to generation over many generations. so our senses are suited for our typical behavior. The greater reality is the reality that our material plane finds itself in, something akin to how cyberspace exists within normal space. We have all these immersive online experiences, but those digital worlds still exist within the confines of our offline world. In fact, that's a great model to use. Imagine being in a room full of people on their own computers all playing the same game. Your game character may find themselves in a firehouse, and the character of the person beside you is on a beach on the other side of the game map. You and the other player can freely interact with each other, but your characters can't. In the game, the characters are on different sides of the digital landscape, but you as players can freely speak and share your snacks if you were so inclined. I'll give you an example. I was chatting online with someone who lived not quite half a continent away from me, and we were discussing working with spiritual beings. I told this person I would introduce them to one of the spirits I work with. In my mind's eye, I could see the person and I sitting across from each other at the same desk looking at our computer screens. Beside us, at the side of the desk between us, was one of the spirits I work with. I said to the person one of the spirits was going to introduce itself. In my mind's eye, I saw it take its hands and put them on both of our shoulders. A moment after, I felt the touch. On screen comes a message from the other person. It says, "What the hell was that?" I asked the person to describe what they meant. They said they suddenly felt a hand on their shoulder. Even though this person and I were not in the same room, the same city, or even the same country, we both felt the contact at the same time. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on everything in the spiritual realm. I'm more someone who has an understanding of how we can interact with it. I'm also not an almanac of who's who as far as spiritual entities go. Like in my material life, I'm only familiar with what I've experienced, and at most, what was shared with me. So being spiritual in the wizard sense means that you can willingly communicate with the spirit realm and entities in it. It also means that you can interact with it and them as well. I'm not sure how deep I want to go with this particular element. Interacting with spirits is more suited for a course than a podcast episode. However, I will cover something about it. All living things have what I like to call a spiritual immune system. We may seem cut off from the spirit realm because our material lives keep us focused on the material world, but we still exist in the spiritual realm. Our spiritual selves still protect us from interference from entities in the spiritual realm. Have you ever noticed that nothing you try spiritually works with your ardently skeptical friends, but it otherwise happens more readily with your friends who believe or are at least willing to accept the possibility of something spiritually happening? Well, there's the possibility that your non-skeptical friends are easily manipulated. Or, and the one we're discussing, is that your skeptical friend's spiritual immune system is blocking the spiritual interaction. You may not be able to do a tarot reading for them. You may not be able to get a Ouija board going with them around. Maybe even if you try to just vibe with them, all you encounter is what feels like a barrier. That's the spiritual immune system at work. I don't fault skeptics for their skepticism about spiritual things, because their spiritual immune system could be preventing them from having recognizable spiritual experiences, especially if they spent their lives thinking all people who deal in the spiritual are crazy or are out to trick them. And if that's the case, why would they accept spiritual experiences? To expand, intention is key to your spiritual immune system. If you ever listen to stories told about being harassed by spirits like hauntings or possessions, you'll notice it's rare that they spontaneously appear at full intensity. There's usually a buildup over a period of time. This is generally because the spirit is doing its best to get past your spiritual immune system. What we are generally never told, except possibly in fiction, is that we aren't weaker than the spirits that interact with us. We are still spiritual beings. We only seem weaker because we live our lives in the material world, so we are distracted from the spiritual one. But we aren't weaker. The whole concept that there are no spontaneous spiritual harassments is testimony to that. I should clarify that I mean as a whole. An individual can be weaker than the spirits harassing them. But again, individually, the person being harassed can also be a lot stronger. Think of stories of hauntings where the homeowner, under no uncertain terms, tells the harassing entity to piss off and never bother them. These hauntings stop right then and there. Those who live with doubt and fear tend to have their hauntings last a long time. The entity lives rent-free in their head, to borrow a term. Your fear and doubt permits the entity to stay around because you aren't taking action against it. I'll cover more of this in future episodes. To recap, sensors are our way of deriving information from the world around us via the stimulus giving us data that our brains can process into information. I've touched on it a bit in the sense and emotions episode, that in the wizard sense, that our spiritual senses manifest like our material senses because the various sensory cortexes are still processing the input for us to understand it. I'll characterize the spiritual mechanism like this. Ourselves have a field around it. This field, you can say, is similar to our hands. They can both interact and manipulate the world around us, and they can also receive sensory information from those interactions. This field is the same, except it interacts with the spirit realm. Just to throw this in, because I used the example that the field functions like our hands, during my time with my trickster teacher, I experienced a great deal of phenomena. One of the things I heard about was seeing through your hands. The whole phenomena was about getting sensory data from a stimulus that isn't typically received by that sensory system. I don't mean synesthesia. I mean, in this case, literally seeing through my fingertips. I was holding a deck of cards, getting ready to deal them for a game of solitaire, when I had this image in my head of having my eyeballs pressed against the bottom card of the deck and seeing it was the Jack of Hearts. I flipped the deck over and the bottom card was the Jack of Hearts. The idea is that the field bypasses the normal sensory system method and directly stimulates the appropriate sensory cortex. Something I also covered in episode 1, Senses and Emotions. Let's discuss this field for a second. The size of the field varies from person to person and depends on your mental state. A depressed mental state can shrink the field, and an excited mental state can expand it. Although it can be expanded and shrunk as required, size is a difficult concept to articulate when dealing with the spiritual realm. As I described in the spirituality section, you can experience non-local effects, so the size of your field could be, for the most part, irrelevant. But I suspect from experimenting that it could still be relevant in the material realm at least. I was taking a class offered by a psychic, and we were doing an exercise with dowsing rods to measure the size of each other's auras. I suspect the field is just what is called our aura, or at least the aura is the part of the field closest to your body. And I was spending my time contracting my aura and expanding it, giving my work partner a difficult time. They could either pick it up from across the room, or they couldn't even find it when they were right up against me. Or worse, they would be ready to give up, and I would expand my field and cause their dowsing rods to respond when they were about to give up. I'll revisit more of this aspect of the field in future episodes, but for now I'm going to jump into a more relevant aspect of it for this discussion. This field is very malleable to our thoughts and intentions. As an example, you can send an image in your mind to another's mind, provided that they have a compatible cortex. They would at least see the image in their mind's eye, although a sufficiently strong sending may cause the receiver to see it instead of what they are looking at. Keep in mind that there are a lot of factors involved in this. There's your spiritual immune system, the effort put into the send, and how distracted the receiver and sender are during this event. What I'm getting at is that, in the wizard sense, the spiritual sensory system can also be a communication system, permitting communication under material circumstances that would prevent communication in the first place, like distance or being in a place where speaking is impossible or not permitted. Remember, as the size of the field doesn't necessarily matter, nor does the distance between you and the person you want to communicate with. Distance and size aren't as big of a factor in the wizard sense. As a reminder, our emotions are our subconscious process's method of communicating with our conscious mind, and often act as motivators and/or instructions on how to react to a situation. For the most part, this is also how they interact in the wizard sense. As previously stated, your subconscious is your resource manager, and your conscious material mind's key to interacting with the spiritual realm. You need to convince it to allow this interaction, otherwise you'll be cut off from it. The fun part of emotions in the wizard sense is that our emotions filter how our personal spiritual energy is expressed and received by others. Think back on episode 1 when I said that there's a belief that emotions are a spectrum just like light. The frequency of the vibe you're giving off has an effect on the individuals perceiving your spiritual energy. Someone like me may go so far as to say that emotions act as a seasoning for your spiritual energy. And someone like me would say that because spirits have shared with me that They have emotions they prefer over others, but even more importantly, I have experiences with beings known as fear eaters on two different occasions. On the first occasion, I was having a nightmare and I felt a presence not of the dream approaching me from behind and put its arms around me. I woke up to see what had done that. After a quick glance, I saw an entity in my mind's eye that sort of resembled a shadow Jesus. It introduced itself as a fear eater and it offered to help me with my fear of flying for an upcoming flight I was going to be on in exchange for eating my fear. It was my first flight, so I had a great deal of fear. So, to a fear eater, I'm sure I was tasty. True to its word, it helped me. I actually got bored for the next 5.5 hours of the flight. Fear eaters seem to generally want to help me with my fear in exchange for letting it feed off it. As opposed to the fear eaters I met on the second occasion, I was flying back from Hawaii and I was having a conversation with a spirit that informed me it was the sky goddess, or Nati for those of you who know about that kind of thing. She informed me that she would help me with my fear of flying. I was not having a good time flying when I went to Hawaii. The conversation was going pretty well and I was feeling pretty good until the weather changed and the flight got really rough. My flight companion asked me why I was worrying. After all, she was a sky goddess and she was sharing the flight with me. So why would she let the jet fall out of the sky? Those words didn't help me and she saw that. It's not like I had automatically believed that she was a sky goddess. I had a trickster teacher. I don't assume anything is as presented. But even if I did, it didn't mean that I knew she had the ability to keep a passenger jet in flight if she wanted to. So she said to me that she had some fear eaters she could use to take the edge off my fear. Given my first experience was a good one, I agreed to that. The fear eaters she brought were different. They seemed like ravenous human-like insects, probably about the size of children. I should probably have clarified that these interactions are happening in the spirit realm and not the material one. A Polynesian goddess sitting beside me on a flight and a dozen child-sized insect people would have panicked the plane for sure. These fear eaters weren't as compassionate as the first one I encountered. They fed off of my fear in the same way starved animals tear apart their prey. Oddly, I did find it helpful. It did ease my fear a bit. I suspect that if the sky goddess wasn't there, these fear eaters would have made every effort to keep the fear growing and deplete me. I'm going to continue this example in the empathy section because what happened next is more relevant there than it is here. My general point is that our emotional state affects how our spiritual energy is perceived, and that can play a role in the spiritual beings we attract to us. Fear brought beings who feed on fear, one who was compassionate, and a group that wasn't. In the wizard sense, empathy is the same, but added to it is the fact that your brain isn't just mirroring based on information from your sensory system, but is also exposed to spiritual energy with an emotional frequency. In other words, you are directly feeling another's emotions. For those of you interacting with spirits, your empathic skills are important to cultivate. Not just your ability to mirror a spirit's emotions, but your ability to properly govern your own emotions. To illustrate that, I'll continue my story about conversing with the sky goddess. As ravenous as the fear eaters were, they weren't reducing my fear to the degree I needed. The flight started getting even worse and my fear started to rise again. I could feel anger coming from the sky goddess. I looked over at her and she started to partially take on the appearance of the fear eaters. She went from being a beautiful Polynesian woman to emulating her own version of what the fear eater's appearance was. She angrily said to me, "This is your doing, get your fear under control." Seeing that my fear was now becoming her problem too, I did what I could to convince myself to trust that I would survive the flight, and my fear started to subside. It didn't completely go away, but it got to a level where she could return to her full goddess splendor and she could send away the fear eaters. There is a concept presented by at least some paranormal researchers. I heard it from Greg Bishop on his podcast Radio Mysterioso. He's also one of the proponents of this idea, that we are co-creators in the paranormal events we experience. So how spiritual beings appear to us in part is our doing. So when the sky goddess was angry at me for her altered appearance, she was probably right. My fear was influencing how she was able to present herself to me. I think this happens in part because of our spiritual immune system and that we may not be weaker than the spirit or the phenomena we are encountering. If we develop our empathic skills, we can cultivate experiences to attract the kind of spiritual beings we wish to work with and to make a better experience for ourselves and them. Think about it like making friends. If you make being around you pleasant, or at least a meaningful experience for those involved, they're more likely to think fondly of you and will be more willing to be around you in the future, maybe even be more likely to help you when you need it. Let's recap. In the wizard sense, spirituality is about being aware of and being able to interact with the spirit realm. The spirit realm is a place where size and distance seems to have very little relevance. Spiritual senses tend to be analogous to our material senses because of our sensory cortexes. But instead of our normal sensory systems, we use a spiritual field that can both sense and manipulate our spiritual environment. Because of that, and that the field is malleable to thoughts and intentions, our systems can also become a more direct communication system. In the wizard sense, emotions affect the flavor of our spiritual energy and are therefore a factor in what spiritual beings we attract to ourselves. And if intense enough, we can even affect how these spiritual beings behave and appear to us. It is also good to cultivate our empathic skills because it permits us to have better and more useful interactions for both us and the spiritual beings we work with. Having spoken about spirituality in the spiritual realm, for the next episode I'm going to cover religion and how it relates to those things. Since I don't know what level of spiritual connection any of you listening may have, I'm going to offer you this as an assignment for this episode. Find one person you have a strong connection with. Spend a week if possible to make their interactions with you as pleasant and or meaningful as possible. Yes, you can tell them what you're up to. You probably don't want them to think you're a complete weirdo, and more than likely their cooperation will make the assignment easier. This may take more than a week, so don't worry about the time constraint I put on it. After you feel you've made a strong bond with them, see if you can send your emotions to them. Just pick one and make a routine of it and see if they can start feeling it. As per usual, look in the episode's notes for the link to the entry for this assignment at the Think Like a Wizard subreddit for more details. I'm excited to hear about your results, so please share how your assignment went there. You're not required to, but it would make me happy if you did. Once again, I'm your host Daniel Dubois. Until next time.